Good to be with you all. And I know it's coming close to Christmas, so it's good to see you all enjoying some nice food. I don't propose to take up too much time here. I just thought I'd share a few ideas, which I think largely are ideas that you will be familiar with anyway. But by way of really just affirming what you're doing in terms of being community centered and also really lifting up that idea of the power and the potential of community. So probably take about 20 minutes of your time, share some thoughts, give you a little report out in terms of what we're learning from different parts of the world, and then leave you guys kind of get on with your conversation. So I think an idea that perhaps most people would be familiar with is the idea that it's better to start with the half full rather than the half empty part of the glass. But I think sometimes people get upset with that idea because they feel that we're ignoring the parts in our communities that are problematic or have needs, or where there are things that are needed but are missing. And I think it's much more useful to start off today's conversation, at least from my perspective, by saying it isn't an either or approach where we're saying, let's start with the half full part of the glass with the assets in our communities, but ignore the needs, ignore the half empty part. I think what we're really trying to say is, if we seriously want to address the problems and challenges and possibilities in our communities, we've got to start from a place of resourcefulness and crescendo out from there. Unless we're, it's a race to the bottom and we're just trying to just keep things from not being bad, as opposed to really building things up so that they can reach their full potential. So the basic idea of asset-based community development is use what you have to secure what you want. If you want to move towards an alternative future, you've got to start with what's strong. The other idea that underpins this is an awful lot of what actually makes us strong is invisible. It's not visible, and it's often not valued. So I wanted to start my sharing today by just reminding us all of the invisible value of relationships at the personal and at the community level. And a lot of what I want to share with you this afternoon is just a remembering again, because I think this is a battle between remembering and forgetting. Remembering the power of connected communities, because in an individualistic society where we're more likely to be humming to the tune of "I did it my way," the idea of Ubuntu, the South African idea that says "I am because we are," is a marginal idea, but it's an important one. After the Russians illegally entered Ukraine and began a process, a genocidal, illegal war against that sovereign nation, one of the things that became really clear was that the people who were going to continue to feed those who stayed behind, and this is true across all of Eastern Europe at the moment, are small local farmers. So I also want to talk about the power of the local and this idea that the community, the neighborhood, the village, the small bounded place is a primary unit of change in moving towards a more sustainable future where we can walk lightly on our planet and actually be better at being humans together, because we desperately need to get better at this. Many of you, I think, in the conversation will spend a lot of your days talking about things like well-being and health and social care and such like. And it's a real dilemma, I suppose you could call it, but it's a little bit of a paradox to me that in the UK, even though 85% of what determines our health and well-being comes from community action, that 80% and more of the money that's spent on health and well-being has nothing to do with community development and a lot to do with the machinery of medicine and pharmacology. Why is that, I wonder? That even though most of what creates our health is related to community development and social and political change, that most of where we put the money is into medicine, even though medicine only determines 15% of our health and well-being? That would be a good question, I think, particularly for those that are interested in social justice in the room today, to ask. Why is that? I wonder whether one of the reasons that is the case is because we're enthralled with institutional solutions. We like techie things. We like experts. We kind of like the idea or the story that says our health is in the hands of the doctor. Our child's education is in the hands of the teacher. Our security is in the response time of the police. And while all of those professions and all of those institutions are incredibly important, they're only a very small part of what keeps us well and safe and wise. And so I think perhaps that in our effort to provide really good services, we've neglected the goose that's laid the golden egg for millennia since we emerged out of the Rift Valley in Kenya 70,000 years ago. And we populated this planet. And it's called community. I'm not just saying this ideologically, by the way, because I love community. I'm saying this because the science tells us it's true. Here's a little bit of the evidence base from which I come from. And I'm interested in evidence because I think it's very easy to spout out ideologies. We have people at all kinds of levels promoting ideology, and it's a dangerous thing to do. So we look at the science here very briefly, just so we're grounded in facts rather than fiction. And we know from the science that you're 4 times more likely to be able to find work if you're in a connected community. You're much safer if you live in a neighborhood where most people know their neighbors by first name and do things together. You're 27% more likely to be healthy if you live in a connected community. And it's interesting when you look at activities, you look at places like, for example, Frome in Somerset, where when they began to try to connect people at the local level, they were reducing emergency hospital admissions by 17%, while their neighbours in the rest of the county were seeing increases to the tune of nearly 30%. So what was different? I think what was different was that in each of those instances, we were seeing, I suppose, what I would call the connected community in action, a willingness to invest in ground-up change rather than top-down change, and a willingness to really take communities and the people who live in neighbourhoods seriously. We know that we'll never lift communities up by putting them down. And one of the best ways we have as professions, and this is true in the third sector as well as in the public sector, of putting communities down, is by starting by only focusing on the half-empty part of what we think their issues are. And that is done primarily in the UK and in Ireland, across the world, through a device called a needs analysis, where we go in and we look at the needs and we look at the gaps and we look at the deficiencies and we look at the problems and we say, see here, see how much these communities need us, see how on their knees these communities are, how dysfunction and, deficient they are. And what's exciting, I think, about what you're trying to do is you're trying to change that narrative from ain't it awful to what's possible. If we start treating people with respect, we're never going to lift communities up by putting them down. But if we start the conversation with a genuine belief that communities don't just consume services, they don't just consume employment services or housing services or safety services or health services, that communities actually themselves create and produce many of these things, not as services, but as ways of being in life. So communities are safety producing, communities are health producing, communities are even economy producing, if we support them the right way. They can't do it all themselves. They do need support, and we do need to supplement their capacities with good services. But we also need to recognize that they are creative and they are producing as well. I think that's a really important insight. We see in places like Leeds, where, it takes something in the region of £47,000 for the city council to put an older person in a congregate care setting with other older people. It costs half of that to invest in doing asset-based community development in a neighborhood, which on average keeps about 10 people who would otherwise be in a congregate care setting in their homes, vibrant, connected, and productive in their community. What I'm describing to you is a backyard revolution that moves away from institutionalizing people towards measuring the success of our society by how interdependent and vibrant people are in their communities. I'm not talking about denying people services. Of course, if a person needs to be in a care setting, they should have the very best of care. But we have to avoid being a one-trick pony, where the only alternative available to people is institutionalization. Most people want to live a good life, interdependent with their families and their communities, and to live a life where they're missed on the days they don't show up, to feel not alone that they're needy, but also that they're needed. Across the UK, I've had the privilege over the last 20 years of walking alongside change makers like Dina and Victoria and many others that are in the room today, yourselves included, who have decided that it's better that we use our assets and our resources to lift people up and to try to support people to live their lives in crescendo rather than diminuendo, to live their lives in terms of tapping into their potential and their promise while also working with them to address their needs. You see, it's not an either-or scenario. It's not about either focusing on what's strong at the expense of addressing what's wrong or vice versa. It's about how can we use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong even stronger still. It's a both and, not an either-or. And when I say let's start with what's strong, I say that because I see across the UK and across Australia and across the other 36 countries that I have served in, that when you do that, the outcomes improve, health inequalities increase, and inequalities go down and equity increases. And in all kinds of other ways, we see better outcomes for people. I just want to finish my remarks today briefly by giving you a report out in terms of what we're learning across the various countries where we've had the privilege of spending time. And I think I can report to you two key things. The first is around the assets or the resources that people use. And the second is around what they use those assets to do, the functions that are taken on. So let me just speak to the first one, the assets. So we now see that in every community, and this is across all kinds of cultures, across all kinds of economic challenges, that there are 6 key building blocks or 6 key assets that are in every neighborhood, village, town, small bounded place, outer estate. And the first and the key one is the contributions of local residents. Most of these assets, as I describe them, are actually invisible. We don't really know that much about them. They're like an untapped reservoir of potential. So if you think about your own community, and if you live in a house, if you could imagine standing outside your house, or if you live in a block, standing at the corner of your block, and having special glasses, X-ray glasses, that allow you to see all of the invisible treasures that are in your community. Imagine being able to see the gifts of every single one of your neighbors right across the life course, regardless of age. Their knowledge, their experience, their passions, their skills, their abilities. Imagine we could see all of those and we could tap into them. Imagine if we knew every single club and group and social network, all of the informal associations, and we were able to tap into them. And imagine if we could tap into all of the assets of the local institutions, the corner shops, the local libraries, if you're still lucky to have one in your neighborhood, all of the local institutions. Imagine if we had schools that weren't shut for 6 months of the year, but were vibrant community centres where you could meet for free, where your children could learn how to have their first allotment, because the school doesn't think of itself as a single issue place where they just educate, but they see themselves as a community asset, and they've figured out that their job is to be good guests in the lives of their communities, not a fortress that we send our kids to. Imagine if you lived in that kind of community where everybody saw the built-in natural environment as an asset. Imagine what might be possible if instead of our money going out of our economies and going into faceless multinationals, that we were able to capture our resource and keep our money circling in our economy. Imagine instead of consuming 90% of our energy from distant, dirty, non-renewable, warmongering monopolies, we were able to finance and create our own energy and actually make enough of it to return money to the grid and then give that money to kids who wanted to set up their own social enterprises. Imagine how different things would be. And then imagine if we supplemented all of those things with really, really great services. That's what we're seeing all over the world. This backyard revolution is really already happening. The genie is out of the bottle. And in all kinds of ways, we are seeing local places enabling health, creating security, caring for their local environment and economy, and doing things with food sovereignty that I think even 2 years ago would have been hard to imagine. But also, I mean, it's often said it takes a village to raise a child, and I think everybody agrees with that. But hardly anybody ever does anything about it. If it takes a village to raise a child, what does it take to raise a village? And how much resource are we putting in to raising the village? You know, maybe the issue is that we don't have a health problem or a security problem or an environmental problem or an economic problem, but we have a village problem in the first instance. And if we could get that right, many of the other issues that we're trying to address could be addressed in a much more interdependent and interconnected way. And ultimately, we would create a culture of care. Some of you who know maybe a little bit about Celtic traditions or know a little bit about weaving will recognize the image that I've used here to show the interrelated nature of all of these functions. And it's two Celtic trinity knots that I've just overlapped to try to show you that it's pretty silly to try to talk about health separate from food, separate from care, separate from security, separate from economy. All of these things are interdependent. And when we bring them to the scale of the local, we can create all kinds of possibilities that are not easily conceived at a national scale. I've just come off a call with friends in Westport who are looking at, as a community of 6,000 people, purchasing a fleet of electric vehicles so that families no longer have to have the burden of trying to find money to buy a car so that they can get to work, but that community purchases a fleet of cars that they share, taking the economic burden of transport off the individual family and putting it on the entire neighborhood. So it takes a village, but the village doesn't just happen. You've got to invest in it. And that starts by focusing on what's strong and then making what's strong even stronger still. And that's the work, I think, and perhaps a good New Year's resolution. So thank you for giving some space to my voice. Thank you.